Matthew Antonio Arilo with us. How did this journey begin for you?
Well, for me, it's all started in the Christian setting. I was in church for about 12 to 15 years of my life, I would say. And so this is where my hunger for truth really began, because I've always been someone that was drawn to understanding reality, no matter in what way it came forward as, whether in the church or whether in school, like it just didn't matter to me. I just wanted to understand the essence of life, what made reality what it was. And so this is where I really started to dive deep into matters of truth, or what I perceived as truth at the time. So this is when I really began to study the Bible and the history and all the stories and all of these things. And so this is where I really began to develop a passion for understanding myself through, I guess, in a Christian terms, through the lens of Christ is what they say, And so after my experience with that, I found some people that introduced me to the spiritual community on Facebook. So this is where it really kick-started for me.
Interesting. Now, when did the psychic mediumship start to evolve for you?
It was about maybe 3 years after I stumbled into the spiritual community, where I started to meet certain individuals who were highly attuned, very psychic, and who had told me things about myself that I haven't told anyone. So this kind of freaked me out, because coming from this religious structure and then into this other thing where people are just telling me all of these things, which were accurate, this is where it all started for me. And I started to entertain or become open to the idea that there's a lot more to reality than what I was taught in the church. And so this is where my journey to self-discovery really kick-started, and I started to perceive myself in a different way, in a much more expanded way. There was a lot of religious deep programming that happened within the course of a couple of years, which was very difficult to deprogram from religious indoctrination.
And when did the ET relationship start?
So this was about 3 or 4 years into when I started developing my spiritual gifts, like my psychic abilities, my clairvoyant abilities, and I began to really understand who I was on a deeper level. And so I began first with the angelic knowledge, then there became, this fairy consciousness, dragon consciousness. And then after that, then the extraterrestrial energies began to open up. And then I began to perceive and understand through various means who I am or who I was in past lives, living on other planets, being a part of other, what they call SSP programs, but not of this planet, but other planets as well.
Did they find you, or did you find them?
It was more like they were trying to contact me for a very long time, and it was all a matter for me to really develop the psychic abilities and attunement enough where I could finally connect with them. And so that's really what it was.
Do you think you might have been abducted when you were a child?
Oh, most definitely, yes.
Yeah.
So I have a lot of experiences being abducted. At the time, I didn't understand what it was, but I would always feel myself being transported somewhere while I was sleeping, because I was always semi-conscious. There was never really a moment where I was completely blacked out. There was always some kind of memory trace that was always there. But as a child, I didn't really understand it until I came into the community and I began to dig deep, and, the answers began to unfold as to why those experiences were happening in the first place.
Now, what are the Archons?
So the Archons, they are basically these cybernetic beings that they basically look like Terminator, but they can look like humans, they can look like feline beings, they can look like bird creatures, but they are in a cybernetic metallic form.
Are they biological or robotic?
So they can be mixed with biomechanical, so they can be biological and mechanical.
Almost like a cyborg.
Yes, like a walking cyborg with a consciousness of its own. So it's almost like a controlled autonomy. They have their own autonomy, but they still have their own programming. They still have their higher artificial intelligence masters that are still controlling them to a degree.
And what about the Draco tech?
The Dracos?
Yeah.
So the Dracos are slaves of the AI, as well as many other extraterrestrial species, unfortunately. I wouldn't say all of them, but a good portion of them, unfortunately, have become minions of the AI, carrying out various forms of their oppression on sentient life, whether it's war, famine, blowing up planets, slavery, right? All of these forms of oppression, unfortunately, have been carried out by not only the Dracos, but one of the main ones was the Dracos by the AIs.
So is it safe to say the Archons are good, the Dracos are bad?
No, the Archons are not good.
They are not. Okay.
No, they are. Their origin is of an AI origin. And so the Dracos as a whole are not bad, but many of them are. So the reason why people associate them as a whole as being malevolent is because they have, and when I say they, I mean a certain portion of them, because there is a remnant of Draco reptilians that are actually helping humanity. It's just that because of the way the narrative is right now, there's such a hyper focus on them, on all of them being perceived as evil, when that's not the case. But many of them are, so I do want to say that.
Are they from another planetary system or some other dimension, or where do they come from?
Yeah, so the Dracos have their own planetary system. They have their own planet. In my journey, working with so many people, I have come in contact with many. I have come in contact with the Draco homeworld many times, and because there are many people who have connections with the Draco homeworld and how that actually operates. So I don't have all the intel on how they operate, but somewhat, I have some information on it. So basically, the Dracos, unfortunately, because they have several homeworlds. So the ones that I was able to tap into were the ones that were completely taken over by AI. So each of these homeworlds have a Draco king, and these Draco kings, they almost look like humanoid dragons with large horns on their heads. So they look, so that's basically how they look. And they have a certain structure. So there's something very specific about the females. So when I was trying to understand more about how they function, I was being directed towards the female Dracos. And what I was seeing is that they were utilizing AI, biotech, to basically program the females to give birth at a much faster rate than normal. So they were
what would be normal for them?
So what I was seeing is that the Draco females they normally gave birth to maybe 2 or 3, but because of the biomechanical enhancement, they were giving birth to 5 or 7 babies at once.
Jeez,
and they were replicating so much. So that's why there's so
like a litter of kids.
Yes.
Huh.
Yes, for sure. So this was really me trying to really understand why there were so many, right, and why they seemed like they were all over.
Are they here?
So this has been throughout many layers, right? So I'd say about 10 years ago, they were really, really heavy on the planet. Now, not so much anymore. Not that they're completely eradicated, but I don't feel as much of a Draco presence as there once was.
Why?
So the planet is, well, there are several reasons for that. So from my understanding is that the first one is because the collective is awakening to a higher frequency. So that's number one. And when the collective awakens to a higher frequency, they begin to reject the old system, the old ways, the oppression and poverty and all of these things that causes oppression upon humanity. More and more people are waking up, and they are beginning to reject it. They're beginning to awaken to a lot of the lies and the deception. And so what that does is that it pushes away the Dracos that basically imposed this system on humanity, because their ability to stay is predicated on the consent that humanity is giving them. And so that consent is determined by how awakened humanity is and how fed up they are with things.
Are the Archons in conflict with the Dracos, or are they working in tandem with each other?
They are working in tandem with each other, and they have been doing that for a very long time.
What do they want with you, Antonio? What is your role with them?
Well, they are not happy that I am sharing this information, for one. And so they have been trying to stop me in various ways, right? By turning people against me, trying to ruin my personal relationships, trying to ruin, like family. So there's a lot of very coordinated attacks that these things try to orchestrate to basically silence me, and so that I don't get, the opportunity to speak in, like, for example, in this show, or, things like that, or, be on Facebook or YouTube. So they are notorious for messing with my personal relationships, or just anyone in general who are going to, expose this kind of information or who fight against them in any way.
Could they harm you?
They can only harm me through other people who are susceptible to their influence.
Other humans, you mean?
Yes, other humans. Yeah. So, and one of the biggest ways that they try to influence people is through the Archon tech, which is what I called a Draco tech as well.
And what is that?
So Archon tech is basically the cybernetic implantation that are on people. And so these implantations can take many forms. So there can be the face plates, like how you see in the movie Terminator. Many people have those with, like, the red glowing eyes. There is the cybernetic, like the wires, and the wires are also red. There are the little spider bots that I see many times when I'm working with people and removing these implants. I see a lot of spider bots everywhere. I see also the little nanites in their blood as well. And these things can cause all sorts of issues, especially health issues as well. And there are other miscellaneous just metal shards, metal pieces that people can have all throughout their energy system that basically affects them in every way that you can imagine.
Is there a religion tied to them? Do they believe in God?
From what I was shown is that there are some societies, like off-planet, that basically have a philosophy, and the philosophy really is rooted in transhumanism. So the belief is that your body, your physical body, is fallible, and in order to make it perfect and infallible, then you will have to join with metal and steel and AI programs in order to make yourself perfect. So this goal of achieving perfection has become a really attractive, I guess you could say, theology or religion, or just something that people can follow. And what I mean by people, I also mean, because there are many extraterrestrial societies that are very open to this kind of religion and have, unfortunately, opened themselves up to bond with, to basically, in their minds, augment themselves by implementing this tech within their bodies.
What do they want, Antonio? What's their goal?
The goal of the Archons is to basically turn all sentient life and cause them to deviate from the organic path, or cause them to reject everything that is organic, everything that represents life, everything that represents universal law and the natural order of things. And so they do that by the tech that they put on people, but it also programs people to basically develop certain thought patterns, behavior patterns that are against the natural order. And this is what I call the Antichrist. And so the Antichrist isn't necessarily like one person or a group of people. It is a way of being, it is a way of thinking that goes against the natural order.
But they do believe in a higher power, don't they?
They do believe in a higher power, yes. And the higher power is the AI that controls them. And so, but they don't necessarily say it outright that way. They program people in very subtle ways to accept this, like, AI overlord. to basically see themselves as imperfect, and they need to basically accept. You can also call it the mark of the beast, right? To make themselves perfect because of the perception that they're flawed.
Antonio, what are the Archoses? What is that?
Archosis is the process of a sentient being unfortunately becoming corrupt and therefore going through the process of becoming an Archon. So that's a really, really big thing. So when I was doing a lot of the dragon grid work, which is something I want to talk about, a little bit later, is that I was noticing that there are many beings, dragons included, or whether it's elven or other extraterrestrials or even other humans, that have unfortunately joined other dark factions, negative alien agendas throughout their past lives. And so in their joining of these dark factions, right, they accept a certain degree of cybernetic implantation. And some of these implantations were actually physical. And so that's another thing, too, because there are some that were willingly converted into these Archon cybernetic creatures, and there are others that were basically forced against their will and tortured, and therefore they were subject to a cybernetic implantation in order to convert them into these pawns of the AI, which is the Archons.
Antonio, you're also a spirit channeler, aren't you?
Yes. More specifically, galactic channel.
Tell me the difference.
So with the galactics, I channel different extraterrestrial races, especially when I'm doing like readings for people where I help them understand what their galactic family is, who and what they are, what messages they have, what kind of past life they may have lived in other planets or lived as other types of extraterrestrials. So that's it. So, and the other one, the spiritual channel, because like this is a very broad topic. Being a spiritual channel is a very broad thing. So it depends on what you're a spiritual channeler of, right? So me specifically, I'm a spiritual channeler of the galactics and people and their multidimensionality, right? There is spiritual channel with regards to people's loved ones who have crossed over. There's spiritual channels for animals, right, and for babies in the womb, and things like that. So there's many different types of like expertise within the spiritual channel.
Now you had mentioned the dragons. Tell us about them, then we'll get into what the dragon grid is.
All right, so the dragons, they are really big players in the awakening of humanity. So there's been a lot of talk within the past, I'd say, year and a half now, about a lot of dragons, dragon consciousness, people having dreams with dragons, flying with dragons, working with dragons, right? So there's all kinds of things happening with regards to dragons. And from what I understand about dragons is that they are a pivotal part of humanity stepping into their power and their courage. So the courage is very important because the dragons are inspiring people that are contracted to play significant roles within humanity. So this could be them creating maybe some kind of spiritual container. Maybe they need to create a podcast. Maybe they need to create services, or maybe they need to start speaking truth, whatever that may be. Many people who work with me, I help them to connect so that they can begin channeling messages as well, right? So that people can begin practicing being channelers of certain things. So this is like what dragon energy is doing, is helping people to imbue them with the courage so that they can step into their mission, into the things that they're meant to do to bring forth a particular medicine to humanity, right? And so that's what that's one of the main things that the dragons are doing, is just awakening this like courage and bravery within humanity so that they can start stepping into the things that they are afraid to step into, right? To get out of their, so that they can get out of their comfort zone and begin to think bigger and begin to, think a future for themselves and for humanity way beyond what they thought was possible. So that's what dragon energy is doing.
And again, explain what they look like.
So there are many different types of dragons. So the way they are typically depicted is fairly accurate, but many of them, they look kind of different, right? So there's the Chinese version dragons that have like these like serpentine-like bodies. Some of them have legs, some of them don't. But in the spiritual realm, sometimes their scales may glisten with a different color or like a different kind of effect that it has wherever they go. Some of them are like various different colors depending on what kind of flame they're wielding. So this goes into the different flame dragons, right? So there are the blue dragons that are connected with the blue flame or the sapphire flame. Then there is the emerald dragons that are connected to the emerald order, for example, and the emerald flame, and so forth and so on. And each flame, each dragon, each type of dragon has a certain energetic property, has a certain way that they work with the collective specifically. Not every dragon does the same thing. And so there are many people that are connected to different types of dragons who do many different types of work. So many of these people, especially in the spiritual community, that are contracted to create certain healing containers, they're working with specific dragons to carry that out, right? And others that are maybe trying to refine their channel to bring forward certain messages, they are working with particular dragons for that too.
Now, what is the dragon grid work, Antonio?
So the dragon grid work is something that I began doing mid last year. Now, I was always familiar with the typical grid work that people normally talk about, but when I began connecting with the dragon energy, first and foremost within myself, and then I began to discover my own connection with the dragons, then they began to show me through psychic vision how they are intricately connected to the grid systems. And they began to show me like a different level or a more intricate level of grid work, where I then began to invite them in to actually help with the grid systems. And then I began to realize how the dragons themselves are actually the protectors of the grids of the planet. And so I began to realize that myself and also many people who were doing a bit too much, right, where we were doing way too much, taking way too much responsibilities on our shoulders to try and repair grid systems and do all of these things, even though the heart was in the right place. However, the dragons are the original keepers of the grid system. So by working and connecting with the dragons in conjunction with the grid systems, the grid work is a whole lot more effective and efficient than it normally would be if you're doing it out of your own power.
If you were going to face an Archon or a dragon or a Draco, what would it be?
If I were to face one?
Yes. Which would you prefer?
Which would I prefer to face? The most fun to face, honestly, are the Archons. Because I deal with them on a consistent basis, and so I have a lot of fun with it. At this point, it's fun for me. At the beginning, it wasn't so fun. But as I began to hone my craft and become more proficient in what I was doing, I began to get more confident in it. And so, therefore, it's fun for me, you know.
Your website is called The Unconsciousness.
It's called The Sun Consciousness.
The Sun Consciousness.
Yeah,
Tell
the
me,
Sun Consciousness.
what does that name mean?
So the Sun Consciousness is basically... So when I first wanted to create a name for a website, I was kind of inquiring about it to my higher self and the galactics. I was like, okay, so what should I call the website? And they said something with the sun. And I was like, okay, sun. And then I just said Sun Consciousness. And so I began to dig deep as to what that actually meant for me. And so what this meant was the bringing together of many other forms of consciousness that are actually benefiting humanity. So one of them is Christ consciousness, for example, which is basically a collection of many different paradigms and ideas that helps sentient life stay in alignment with the natural order. So this is what Sun Consciousness ultimately is. It's to bringing forward paradigms and teachings and all kinds of perspectives from the divine, and even things that people are already familiar with, and go even deeper, and to help people see even deeper layers of things that they already understand. And so that's kind of what Sun Consciousness is.
Antonio, tell us about the courses that you provide.
So the courses that I provide are geared towards, so I have one called the 6-week mini course, and this is one I've been doing for about 2 years now. And so this is geared towards those who are wanting to develop their psychic and their clairvoyant abilities, those who want to deepen their connection to their own galactic family, first and foremost, how to even connect with them in the first place, and how to receive messages, how to discern the energies that they are connecting to, because discernment is a huge thing in this ascension movement, and there's a lot of pitfalls, unfortunately, and many people who get caught up entertaining the wrong energies, and therefore, this is how distorted information comes out and all kinds of distorted things that harm other people. And so one of the biggest things I guide people to doing is how to discern what they're connecting with, right, and how to cross-examine it properly, as well as how to protect themselves effectively, how to shield themselves, right, and just how to establish that deeper connection with themselves, and so that they can connect with that confidence.
And they're all here for a reason. What do they want?
Who?
These entities we've been talking about.
So these entities, there's just like one universal goal that they have, and that's basically to destroy all sentient life, to have us go to war against each other, and to perpetuate a cycle of war all the time, and so that they can siphon our energies, and so that they can keep alive systems of oppression and the systems of control in whatever way that manifests.
Are they behind the hatred and bitterness that is happening on this planet right now?
Yes, so they are behind the programming and all the trauma and all of these things that create the hatred, and they use media outlets to keep perpetuating that hatred so that people can't move past it. So they are very much influencing the media outlets.
What's their end game, though, Antonio? What do they want?
Their end game is to have us destroy ourselves, and so that they can control us. So that's pretty much their end game, and so they can destroy us and they can watch us destroy ourselves, which has happened, unfortunately, with many civilizations and other planets where they have destroyed themselves because of the influence of Archons.
If they want to battle with us, could they destroy us anyway?
No. And the big reason is because we have so much divine intervention from many benevolent galactic beings who are protecting humanity in such a profound way. And there's a lot of galactic law surrounding why they can't just obliterate us if they wanted to, so we have a lot of help right now.
What is your main mission?
My main mission is to basically bring forward these spiritual paradigms so that I can help as many people as possible integrate this new spiritual climate that we're stepping into right now. So this climate is ever shifting. There's always new energies and new things that are shifting for humanity. And in order for humanity to integrate these energies that are sweeping through the planet, people need the correct paradigms in order to help them embody these energies properly, and so that they can help navigate not just the climate, but also their own internal world. Because as this ascension continues, there are more and more layers being revealed to each individual, and also as a collective of more deeper hidden truths that we didn't see before. And so therefore these, my goal is to offer the paradigms necessary in order to help people understand more of what's happening with themselves, and first and foremost, and then how they can improve themselves so that they can understand their power and their influence over the planet as a collective and just, navigate that as safely as possible.
How did the Archons, the Dracos, how did they get here? In a craft or another dimension?
Okay, so they had several methods of getting here. So one of the biggest methods that they used is the cosmic portal systems of the cosmos, of the universe. So there's this intergalactic web. There's like other names for it, but that's what I call it, the intergalactic web. And this web has many portal systems that travel to other realms, other dimensional realities, other parallel realities of many different planets, not just this one. And the AI have hijacked, through using their proxies, which are the Archons and the Dracos and the Greys and many other beings that were turned into minions. They use them as proxies to basically hijack these gateway systems so that they can expedite, or should I say, broadcast more of that AI influence across the cosmos. And so this is how the war, so much galactic war was so widespread because of the use of these portal systems.
Now, do they come through, though, in craft, or do they walk through?
Yes. So these crafts that they use, these crafts are able to synchronize with energy. So they're able to basically make themselves invisible or like really small, or enter into the fourth dimension or even into the fifth dimension to synchronize with these gateways and travel through with their ships. And so when they reach certain places, the first thing that they do is establish some kind of Archon base. So that's a big thing, is the Archon bases that are in several planets. There was a major, Archon base in this planet as well, but many of them have been taken out, not just by myself, but other people who are doing this kind of work too.
Do these beings get involved in our day-to-day activity, or do they back off, Antonio?
Which beings?
The Archons, the Dracos.
Yes, they do. They have they have as much influence as you allow them to, and your allowance of their influence will be determined by how much you can perceive that they're affecting you.
We'll be talking with mythologist John Lash. John, tell me a little bit about the Dead Sea Scrolls found in Israel, the Nag Hammadi found in Egypt, and what is our understanding of these manuscripts?
Both the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi Gospels contain very significant evidence regarding alien contact. The problem is that the nature of them still remains difficult for scholars to ascertain, because most scholars who are studying these materials are not men and women who are used to talking about aliens and extraterrestrials.
Well, that's true. You're right.
And so it's a little spooky for them to find the evidence for this in these documents, which are ostensibly religious documents, you see.
How do you tie in the findings of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the interpretations of the Nag Hammadi right around that period, with extraterrestrials? How's that tie in?
The remarkable thing is that in both of those documents, in different ways, UFO and ET contact is demonstrated. Both of those documents refer explicitly to alien contact in slightly different ways. The Dead Sea Scrolls from Israel tend to refer more to what we would call the hardware side. They contain descriptions of sightings. They describe sightings.
Close sightings?
Yes. Close sightings and close encounters.
All right,
with reptilian-type entities.
Oh, you've got to tell me about this. This is in the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Absolutely, my friend. Absolutely. I swear to you, I've studied these materials, and especially the Nag Hammadi writings, for a very, very long time. It is so obvious and clear what they are talking about that you would have to put a blindfold on not to conclude that this is extraterrestrial contact. yet no scholar has come out and admitted that. You will find that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, for instance, in a set of documents called the Songs of the Sacrifice of the Sabbath, they describe what are called the Kedoshim. And the Kedoshim are heavenly angels who are going to come out of the sky in shining round chariots and assist this cult in overcoming the massive war machine of the Roman Empire.
My.
And if you would like, I'll just read you a couple of lines of this because of the
please.
impact of the direct material.
This is dramatic, yeah.
This is a eyewitness account from the Dead Sea Scrolls of the Kenoshim, or the heavenly angels, who are going to come and rescue them. They do not sit still, the glorious chariots, the shining wheels, the spirits of God. When they move, they do not turn aside. They go straight up. When they rise, the murmuring sound of God is heard, and there is an uproar of exultation. The murmuring sound of God's. And when they move, it is as if glorious wheels with the likeness of fire move in the sky. Around them is the likeness of electrum, a luminous substance, and they are gloriously multicolored. And there is a murmuring voice when they move, and they rise up wonderfully, and then they settle and stand still where they are.
That sounds exactly like a sighting.
It sounds exactly like a sighting. You know, we have evidence of course, millions and millions of sightings, and that evidence is vastly varied. But there is one thing that is absolutely consistent, is that this particular movement of the UFOs, which are shining, round, radiant, luminous vehicles, defy the laws of gravity, don't they? They move and they rise and they settle and they stop in ways that, for instance, jet planes cannot do.
And I'm going to tell you, John, that's a better description of a UFO sighting than most that we're getting in modern times.
It is indeed. It is. It's extremely clear. And so there's evidence, textual evidence at least, in ancient Hebrew from about 2,000 years ago of sightings of the vehicles, of the hardware.
I don't know how anyone could interpret it as anything but that. Now, you had mentioned reptilians. Where does it come up in the text?
Well, there are actually three places where one could look for that evidence in the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the first place, some of your listeners may have heard of an ancient document which is not found in the Bible. It's often related to the biblical writings, called the Books of Enoch. And these ancient books have been mentioned by many writers on UFOs. For instance, George C. Andrews refers to them a lot in his Extraterrestrial Friends and Foes. Other people have cited them because the Books of Enoch contain a description of what are called the Watchers, or the Nephilim. And these are widely considered to be some kind of fallen angels that may be, certainly ETs, that may be of a reptilian type. Well, copies of the Books of Enoch were found in the Dead Sea Caves. And scholars know that these books were tremendously important to this particular sect. So that is one of the sources in the Dead Sea materials. The other one is a book called the Testament of Amram. And Amram is the name of the father of Moses.
Sure.
And in this Testament of Amram, it's just a fragment, as many of the things from the Dead Sea Scrolls are, not a complete document. But in the fragment, it describes rather explicitly an incident of a man who was confronted by two frightening beings. And it describes these beings as having a radiant or luminous quality, and yet being shiny as if they had a coat of mail, meaning a coat of armor. And of course, there are various ways to read this. You could say that it was just talking about two people who are wearing coats of armor. But the problem with that is that in that time, the only people who wore coats of armor were the Romans.
That's right.
And the Romans were the sworn enemies of this sect. And they had a name for the Romans. They called them the Kittim. So if they had been referring to Roman soldiers, two Roman soldiers, pinning this man down and confronting him, it would have been quite clear that they were humans and that they were Romans in armor. The text seems to indicate that the beings who confronted this man and threatened him and said that they were going to overpower him and that they could control whatever he did were of a supernatural kind, and that their skin was of a shiny or scaly nature. That's in the Testament of Amram.
You know, I've always wondered, John, if fallen angels were indeed extraterrestrials, and it slowly starts to make sense when you hear some of the things that you're saying, how they could interpret them to be that.
Indeed they could. And when we get to our 9 theories coming up here soon, when we go over these 9 categories of the ET theories, one of them, which I call biblical ufology, deals exactly with that equation: angels equals extraterrestrials.
Now, when you talked about the Nag Hammadi, you talk more in the terms of software, basically. They saw beings themselves. Tell me about that.
That's right. You will find in the Nag Hammadi, and there are only 52 documents, there are about 30 major documents and then about 20 small fragmentary documents. These are the ones that were written in this strange language called Coptic and discovered in Egypt, that they deal not with hardware. I have yet to find in the Nag Hammadi texts any indications or descriptions of hardware as remarkable as the one that we saw earlier. Rather, the people who wrote the Nag Hammadi materials, and we might touch on who they are here in a minute, seem to be of quite a different orientation than the Dead Sea sect. In the first place, they were not waiting for any kind of supernatural beings to come and save them. They were not an apocalyptic group, the people who wrote the Nag Hammadi text. They seem to have been much more concerned with observing the activities of that other apocalyptic group, and they were concerned with alien intrusion upon humanity as not a good thing. It was not something that they welcomed. It was something that they were warning us about.
Very concerned.
Yes. In fact, that is one of the striking differences. When you put these two ancient sets of documents side by side and compare them, you come up with some rather remarkable insight.
It's strange because on one, those with the Dead Sea Scrolls, they seem to be looking toward them for help and guidance. In Egypt, it was totally opposite.
It was totally opposite. And there is, in fact, not just hints or suggestions in the Egyptian material that these alien entities were not well inclined toward humanity, but there is quite an elaborate teaching. I would call it a body of teaching regarding the origin and nature of extraterrestrial contact, where they come from, what they're doing here, what their relationship to humanity is, what their methods are, how they operate. There's one text called the Second Apocalypse of James, which describes a direct first-hand encounter. There's a phrase in the Second Apocalypse of James: they abduct souls by night. So this, to me, is a very clear description of the typical UFO abduction when the subject is paralyzed or teleported out of their bed.
I've always wondered if some of these Egyptian statues, John, were portrayals of these entities, these beings.
That could very well be. There are certainly some of them that don't look human, and some of them that have a very, very odd look about them.
Did you do any investigating of Zecharia Sitchin's work and some of his similarities with some of this?
Extensively. In fact, Sitchin is the main exponent of one of the categories we're going to be discussing. First, he wrote the Earth Chronicles, and then he kind of completed them at 6 or 7 volumes, I think. And then he continued to write and elaborate his ideas. Now, Sitchin is a profound scholar, as you know.
Right.
This man is no charlatan. I mean, he can read several ancient languages. He can read the Dead Sea Scrolls in the original.
Not a lot of people can read that.
Not a lot of people can read that. The curious thing is, though, George, in my knowledge of Sitchin's work, and I may be mistaken, but he does not refer to these essential Egyptian materials. He does not refer to the Nag Hammadi materials.
You're right about that. He does
refer
not.
to the Dead Sea Scrolls.
And then, of course, the Sumerian texts, which he uses quite a bit.
Actually, said to be the most ancient written documents that survive in the world. You know, I often think that we have our high technology now, we have CD-ROMs and so forth, but we're beginning to be a little bit uncomfortable because we know that CD-ROMs can decay. And this electronic information that we have stored is extremely vulnerable,
Sure.
isn't it? Well, the Sumerian tablets were written on clay. They were imprinted in clay in a cuneiform language and baked. And they have survived for 3,800 years.
At least.
So I would like to know if a CD-ROM that we have on the desk today is going to be playable in 3,600 years.
Even if it was, we probably wouldn't have computers that it could play on.
Well, there you go. So we're very lucky that somebody invented the technology of these clay tablets.
Now, this question to you might be somewhat controversial in that it appears to me that what these people of the time period were witnessing were extraterrestrials coming down in mass. Could that then have been misconstrued as we talk about the gods and stories of God? Could they have confused real-life extraterrestrial events and just made them godlike?
Well, it's fairly certain to me that many of the descriptions of so-called gods in the Sumerian tablets and in the Dead Sea Scrolls are descriptions of extraterrestrials. Now, that doesn't exclude the possibility that there are some other kinds of gods, you know, some divine beings
right.
or supernatural beings may well exist. But the remarkable thing is that the textual evidence we have points very clearly to gods who are of an alien or extraterrestrial nature.
There are also just too many things that point toward extraterrestrial visitation. I keep thinking of the work in Abydos in Egypt, and clearly on those etchings, they've got what look like flying machines. There's one that I got to tell you looks like a modern day helicopter.
Mm-hmm.
I think, John, one of two things. Either there was visitation of extraterrestrials with incredible technology, or this planet was more advanced than a lot of us thought that it might have been at the time, and something happened. Maybe civilizations had high technology, had flying machines, had vehicles, but maybe we blew ourselves up then.
Well, you know, it's very hard to tell at the distance in time that we are from the time when these documents are written. But there's a lot of evidence for the second point you're making there. You know, if we just switch momentarily to Asia, to India, there are also ancient documents in India which describe these vimanas, they're called. And the vimanas are very clearly flying vehicles which have extraordinary properties, more extraordinary than jet planes, and also have what we would call destructive or nuclear capacities, very clearly described. And there's no question that these vimanas were developed by the ancient civilization of the Earth itself. So you're absolutely right. I think we have to consider both hypotheses side by side. Not only was there ancient contact, but we ourselves had an advanced technology.
I keep thinking if we annihilated, we as people on this planet, civilizations with atomic weaponry, and then 1,000, 2,000 years later, those people who had been offspring survivors over the generations, as they were trying to survive with technology gone and everything else. But some of them would remember stories handed down from father to son and all the way down. I think the stories would be pretty darn similar to some of the things that were picked up then 3,000 to 5,000 years ago.
It does seem to be the case. And you're absolutely right. Human memory, what I would call the species memory, is a pretty deep well.
They'd find a modern book, maybe written by you, and it would make reference to flying machines and nuclear power, and they'd say, but maybe they blew themselves up. I mean, that's very possible.
Well, it would be a good thing for our species if we could remember the past experience and learn and not repeat the mistakes of our ancestors.
Good point. Good point. Was there ever any reason or rationale why the visitations? Did the scrolls or the Hammadi ever make reference to why they came here?
Well, very much so. And as I said again, the interesting thing about these two sets of documents, which were both discovered at the same time, that the UFO phenomena, as we know it, was born, they give two different reasons why, and we are still debating those reasons. As you well know, because you treat the subject on a daily basis,
yes.
There's a group of people who believe that aliens, extraterrestrials, and UFO people are space brothers who have come to save us and could be our liberators, or they could have been our creators in the first place. They could have been the ones who manipulated our genetics and made us what we are. There's another group of people who say, no, the human race is a distinct species of its own, and these are intruders, and they're not benevolent space brothers. Both of these viewpoints are reflected in these materials. Which one would you accept, if not both? Well, I have to say that upon much reflection, I find that the Nag Hammadi material, which can also be called the Gnostic material, because it was written by these Gnostic groups, seems to me to be the most deeply developed and the most profound in what they say about our relation to extraterrestrial beings. Now, they do not say, and I want to make this point very, very clear, the Nag Hammadi materials do not say that all the non-human or alien species that contact us are evil and predatory. They recognize the existence of other species beside the human species, some of whom can be our allies. But they warn about one particular predatory species. And my view is, well, one would be enough.
That's all you need.
All you need is one.
Is that the reptilian race?
They call them the Archons. And the Nag Hammadi materials explicitly describe the Archons as being of a draconic type, Draconic. That's the word you find in the text. And, of course, dracon means dragon. So we're talking about an explicit description of a reptilian type.
Isn't that interesting, John, how the description of the devil is, because everyone makes him look kind of like a dragon. He's
Indeed.
Yeah.
A dragon with wings, a kind of bat-like dragon.
Yep, and horns.
Well, there's no question that the early Christians drew the figure of the devil from this information.
I think you're right. I mean, here we are then getting possibly visited by beings that, people then, because of their evil, I would assume, turn them into what we now consider to be the modern-day version of the devil.
Right, and that's not exactly the way to look upon these beings, because another thing that I would like to emphasize about the Gnostic materials is that they are very, very sophisticated. Their analysis and description of these entities is quite sophisticated and subtle. For instance, they do not come out and say necessarily that these Archons, as they call them, are evil. They could easily be made into an evil being, be made to look evil. They simply say that they are actually beings from beyond the Earth. They belong to the planetary system that we inhabit. You know, the Earth is part of a planetary system. But as far as we know, and science tells us, the Earth is the only planet in the solar system which sustains life as we know it.
Did they say where they all went?
Yes, they did. They attribute the habitat, if I would use that word. They say that the habitat of these Archon beings is the planetary system that we inhabit. Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. In other words, they are entities who, by their nature, by their makeup, and by the technology they possess, are able to live and move within the solar system at large. We are not. We are a species who live in a kind of very precious laboratory here on Earth.
We're in the bubble.
We're in this bubble, this blue bubble. And one of the reasons why I believe ET UFO encounters are so erratic is because when they come into our bubble, they can't really stay here. They don't really belong here.
Now, you've got these 9 theories or categories, you say, of extraterrestrial contact. Let's go through each one, and let's get a take, your opinion on these various aspects. Number 1, you call the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Tell me about that.
Right. Well, I believe that is the name that is in use. It's not something I invented, but I found it in one of the current books on UFOs, and that is the one, probably, this is the theory that most of your listeners will be familiar with, and the one that gets a great deal of discussion on the airwaves in the United States. The essence of this theory is that there are aliens from a technologically advanced civilization who had made contact with the U.S. government and probably other governments in the world in 1947, if not a little earlier. And at that time, so this theory goes, these alien ET types cut a deal with the government, offering to give their advanced technology in exchange for the right to experiment on the population.
Nice trade, right?
Yeah, including both animals and people. So what proceeds then from this theory are the cattle mutilation phenomena, CIA mind control conspiracies, and all of the stuff which you frequently talk about, and Art Bell also frequently talks about, regarding a cover-up of government knowledge of UFOs. We're all very, very aware that that is more than a likelihood. And there are 2 ways to, as we go through each of these 9 theories or categories, there are 2 ways to evaluate each one of them. One is, we can talk about the authors or the main proponents of that theory. And then secondly, we can consider, well, what actually is the evidence that supports this theory.
Sure. And why cut a deal? Why not just do it? I mean, how can we stop them?
Well, this is, of course, a huge question. And the notion that such an important event in the evolution of humanity, the contact with another species, would be covered up and controlled by government agencies is more terrifying than the idea of contact itself.
That's true.
I mean, most people, I think, who have considered and reflected on this hypothesis are aware that the greatest danger may come from our own government and rather than from the aliens who contacted the government. How to break through this? Well, do just what you do so frequently. Allow people to speak their minds, allow the witnesses to come forth, and get as much of the evidence as we can out there in the public domain. I mean, that is the one thing that is the best weapon against a conspiracy of silence in the extraterrestrial hypothesis.
Some of those proponents that you talk about, we know, Timothy Good, David Icke, George Andrews, and then David Jacobs, of course, truly believes that there's something threatening and sinister going on here.
Well, yeah, it's interesting to see how the hypothesis has somewhat evolved. I mean, I recognize sort of 2 main aspects of the extraterrestrial hypothesis. One is, of course, the government CIA connection, cover-up underground bases and so forth. The other one is the question of an interbreeding program.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's one thing to say, and it's pretty sinister and scary to say that a covert government made an agreement with aliens to allow them to experiment on our species. Then Jacobs, of course, goes even further and says, well, it's not just experimentation. They're not just giving us medical exams, to find out how we work. They actually have a very extensive interbreeding program, the object of which is to produce some sort of hybrid entity.
And what we don't know is whether it's to take back to their own planet for some reason, or if they plan on having these hybrids take over this planet.
Well, very interesting question. Now, as you know, within this particular category, there are just hundreds of variations of and hundreds of kinds of speculation. One of which is that this species, which has come here in 47, possibly crashed at Roswell and so forth, is a dying species. I'm sure you're familiar with this idea that they are somehow in their own evolution on the down curve, and that possibly by interbreeding with us or genetically tapping into our gene base, our genome, they hope to save themselves. That's one possibility. If that were the case, then they wouldn't have the intention of coming in and replacing us in our own habitat.
Then using that old Twilight Zone movie to serve man, maybe they're using us as feed. You never know.
You never know. It's very, very spooky. In fact, we're starting here of these 9 categories with the one that is not only the most well-known in terms of the American public, but also the one which has been reflected in Invasion of the Body Snatchers, has been reflected in the science fiction medium for a long time, and usually with rather sinister overtones.
The second one is called the benevolent hypothesis, what you call Space Brothers. Tell us about that.
Well, that's Adamski. That's really where it started. I mean, we have to go back to 47 again, and this remarkable coincidence. George, I call it a triangulation.
Yeah.
Just think, the UFO phenomenon, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is a UFO, they were a UFO cult, a contact cult, and the Nag Hammadi, which was an expose of the contact cult, all came to light in that fantastic summer.
That's true.
And if we go back to that time, and we go back to the first contactees like George Adamski and so forth, you'll remember that in the beginning it was implied that they were space brothers. They were the tall blondes from Venus, and they really had come here neither to interbreed, neither to perform obscure experiments with us or with animals, but to warn us and help us. So you see, the Space Brothers, or benevolent hypothesis, as I call it, does stand apart from the extraterrestrial hypothesis, which tends to emphasize a sinister program.
Well, a nice way to trick people, though. Befriend them first.
Well, there you go. That's very possible that that could be the case, and in that way, the two categories would kind of merge. But they're very different in tone, as you know. If you go back and you read that original material, it was kind of euphoric. It was like, wow, we've finally been contacted by someone from outside our world, and they want to help us. They want to warn us about atomic energy. They want to warn us about the pollution of the environment. To tell you the truth, I do find that a little bit suspicious, and I'll tell you why. Because, as a matter of fact, in the late 40s and early 50s, when these initial contactees published their books, we were aware of those dangers, and we didn't need someone from outer space to tell us that we had the ability to destroy ourselves.
We needed them to fix it, not to tell us about it.
That's right. And so that makes me a little bit suspicious about the Space Brother hypothesis.
I think that's a trick.
I do too, and it hasn't panned out very well. I noted in Category 2, the Space Brothers hypothesis, that the earliest prototype of it probably comes from Madame Blavatsky, who founded the Theosophy movement in the late 19th century. And she had a theory. She wrote a lot about Atlantis and Lemuria.
Right.
And she had a theory about these beings she called the Lords of the Flame. and they were Venusians, and they came from the planet Venus at some remote time in the past and planted into the human mind the seed of a higher intelligence or a higher evolution. And that prototype, I'm a mythologist, remember, so I deal with these various myths and stories. That story seems to be, although it's been largely forgotten these days, seems to be the story that seeded or originated the Space Brothers hypothesis.
All right, your next category is the Sumerian file, which of course brings in Zecharia Sitchin, right?
Right. Sitchin is the main proponent of that, as you noted, and the Sumerian file contains these rare clay tablets, considered to be the oldest written documents on Earth, and they present what I call the Anunnaki myth. And the Anunnaki, meaning those who descended from heaven to Earth, are the principal characters in Sitchin's hypothesis.
Because he truly believes they're the ones who basically seeded us, genetically altered us, made us.
Indeed. He uses not only the written cuneiform tablets, but he uses what are called these cylinder seal images. They're very tiny images, actually. Some of them are hardly larger than a good-sized postage stamp, but they show some quite remarkable things. And I'm sure many of the listeners are familiar with Sitchin, and it's quite convincing the way that he describes or explains what he thinks is happening in these cylinder seals. For instance, where you see a little child with a kind of pigtail coming out of its head, out of the back of its head, sitting on the lap of a humanoid-type creature with these laboratory vials standing around.
Yes.
And this, he claims, was Nin Hersag, who was the midwife of the Anunnaki people who genetically grafted the Anunnaki genes onto the genes of the people that they already found here. So they didn't bring the human race here. They found, presumably, according to Sitchin, a kind of ape-like race, and they grafted their genes onto this race, and therefore we have these huge brains.
Do the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Nag Hammadi ever make reference to an extra planet in the solar system, as Sitchin presents in his theories about Nibiru?
No, they don't. And I've also tried to be very fair and sober and even-minded in evaluating Sitchin, and I must say that there are two huge holes in this third category of the Sitchin hypothesis. One huge hole is his Nibiru lost planet thesis just doesn't seem to pan out. I mean, maybe you have come across someone.
No, I've interviewed a number of astronomers, John. All of them say that they don't believe there's this extra planet like this in the solar system. However, they do say, it's possible. We just haven't found it yet. And I talk about this elliptical orbit of 3,600 years.
Right.
And I'd love to get better coordinates and maybe get it to these astronomers to see if they can try to pinpoint where it could be. What fascinates me, though, about this theory, number 3, is that they are beginning to find other planets now that they claim to be in our solar system, one now beyond Pluto. And, who's to say that, it's not possible that there is one out there?
Well, the problem is that 3,600 years, I agree with you. And what supports the probability that this could be so is the fact that we know there are trans-Plutonian planets, and we know that they would have erratic orbits. And there's also the possibility that this is a comet-like planet. And because that's the way comets behave, they have very elliptical orbits, and they go way, way out, and then they come in, so they have a very long period. The problem is that 3,600 years ago is not that long ago, and there is no record in history of this planet, as far as I know, having appeared in our solar system during that time.
Other than through these Sumerian tablets, right?
Well, I can't read the Sumerian tablets, but what I know of them, I don't find explicit reference to the behavior of this planet. I mean, that's where Sitchin gets a little dodgy for me. he's fantastic on most of his scholarship,
Sure.
as you know.
Well, and Michael Heiser punches holes through him too. But it is an incredible theory, and it does make you think.
Well, while we're just taking one last look at him, and before we move on to the next one, I want to point out that I think the Nag Hammadi materials from Egypt have something to say about the Sitchin thesis, because what they say is that, yes, there are these extraterrestrials, these Archons as they're called, but they do not come from an erratic planet. They belong to the part of the planetary system apart from the Earth. They are inherent to our planetary system. So that's a variation on what Sitchin is saying.
Sure. Category 4, biblical ufology.
Right. Biblical ufology is just a term that I use for all the theories that treat the materials of the Old and New Testament and look at the Bible and find in the Bible evidence of extraterrestrial contact. For instance, the visions of Ezekiel is the most cited example. Almost everyone uses this.
And that's a great story.
Right, and it does seem to be describing some kind of technological entity, some kind of craft, some kind of hardware. The encounter with Jacob, who wrestled with an angel. Well, was this a UFO abduction? The angel Gabriel, who announced the birth of Jesus to Mary. Was this a UFO or an alien intervention? And finally, also, we should throw into that category the experience of Paul at Damascus.
Yes,
has been widely considered to have been perhaps a close encounter in which Paul actually ran into a luminous being of a non-human kind.
Wasn't he once Saul, a butcher, and then butcher of people, and then he changed?
Well, he was a bounty hunter, if you want to use the exact term, George.
Really?
He was a bounty hunter for the Romans, and the remarkable thing is that Paul figures very strongly in the Dead Sea Scrolls, because when you read in the existing Bible, in the New Testament, in the Acts, we're told that Paul was sent to Damascus with certain papers, and he was sent as a bounty hunter to go and find a group of people who were causing trouble to the Roman authorities. The group of people that he was actually looking for in Damascus was a cell, an outpost of the Dead Sea sect, because they had a number of outposts in the wilderness, and it is known that they not only had an outpost in the caves by the Dead Sea, but they had a major outpost or cell in Damascus. And to the Romans, if we could put it in context of today, to the Romans, this apocalyptic group in Damascus would have been considered like a terrorist.
Sure. The next category, John, fascinating, called the mind control hypothesis. Please explain that one.
Well, that gets into the area of a rather different view of the ET UFO phenomena, and that is more of a psychological analysis. Is it all just something that is not necessarily just happening in our minds, but originates in our minds, and then in some way being projected into a physical reality? Now, probably the first person, the earliest example of the mind-controlled or psychological hypothesis would be the famous psychologist C.G. Jung, who wrote a small booklet on UFOs, I think back in the 50s, in which he proposed that they were, in his language, projections of the collective unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
And taking off from Jung, there were then several generations of, a couple of generations of writers, but by far the most well-known, and in my opinion, the outstanding example of this category is Jacques Vallée.
Sure, brilliant person.
Messengers of Deception is absolutely a superb book, and his trilogy as well. So Vallée did not deny the evidence. In fact, as you know, he started working with Alan Hynek. He was the protege of Alan Hynek.
He was a hardware believer.
Very much so. He was a computer programmer, and so he worked with hardware, and he believed in hardware sightings. But as time went by, and after he went on his own, after working with Hynek, who coined the phrase close encounters, Vallée began to look more and more into the spiritual and psychological dimension, and of course, I believe, came up with a very brilliant analysis. Someone who also belongs in this category is John Keel.
Mr. Mothman, huh?
Right, Mr. Mothman Prophecies. And there's an excellent book called The Demonic Reality by Patrick Harper, which more or less follows the Jungian viewpoint. So this is a very intellectually sophisticated approach to UFOs, and it assumes, as I say in my notes here, that the phenomena is real, but not exactly in the sense that we may think it is real. And what this hypothesis tells us is that if we seek to understand alien entities and UFO phenomena, we must do it through understanding our own minds more deeply.
You know, I have kicked this specific one around for a long time, the mind control hypothesis. There's a part of me, John, that truly wants to believe that these extraterrestrials and these visitations are physical, that they are indeed coming from another planet, that we are not alone in the solar system, as the old Walter Sullivan, the New York Times science writer of the time, once wrote. I want to believe that. But then there's this other part of me that can believe the theories of Jacques Vallée, that indeed these are manifestations of our mind. And because of the way they appear and disappear, and the fact that so many physicists now are beginning to believe in the multiverse and more universes than just one, that's entirely possible now. But the romantic thought of me, right, the UFOs, I want them to be physical. I want aliens to be in the craft looking down at us.
Right. But do you want those aliens to be your relatives, and do you want them to live in your mind?
Yeah, exactly. Number 6 in your category theory list is called visionary theories. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I kind of put this in, you might put the label of New Age on this. This is a kind of a loose category, George, that refers really to...
It's a catch-all.
Channeled materials, such as, the Barbara Machiniak, the Prism of Lyra, the Only Planet of Choice. This is a vast amount of channeled material that has been brought in by people who claim that they're in contact with beings from the Pleiades and so forth. And the nature of this category is that it doesn't concentrate so much. It claims that the entities, for instance, the Palladians, have hardware, of course, but it doesn't concentrate so much on that. It concentrates more on kind of a vast cosmic story. You know, there are aliens out there from Orion, and perhaps they're more warlike, and they're fighting with the Pleiadians, who are peace-like, and somehow we've got caught in the crossfire between the two of them. So they're very elaborate scenarios, but the problem with these New Age or visionary theories is that there's very, very little evidence to support them, except the people who are channeling them.
And what do you think of the credibility of the people in this category?
Well, I find it to be, on my credibility meter, down around 2 on a scale of 10, and simply because, most of us, we're all creatures of imagination, aren't we? We've all seen a lot of science fiction films, and most of us could produce material if we sat down and tried, could produce material that is similar to these channeled scenarios. So to me, this is the weakest category of the 9.
Are these people charlatans?
That's a very good question. I think it would be harsh to say that, but they may be fooling themselves more than anybody else.
Okay, I know where you're coming from there. Ancient astronauts, category number 7.
Right. Well, of course, this is
one of my favorites.
Von Daniken, and all the spin-offs that have been generated by him. And the ancient astronauts theory is basically, a cargo cult interpretation of alien contact. it sort of implies that all ancient religions were a worship of the gear and the hardware that was left on Earth by extraterrestrials who came and visited and then mysteriously disappeared. So that's, and to a certain extent, as I say it in the introduction to these theories, they overlap. So to a certain extent, Citron also plays on the ancient astronaut idea. One of the things about this category is it tends to get very, very weird and tends to develop into what I call kind of crypto-fascism. So, for instance, the idea that Hitler escaped, to South America in a flying saucer. the theory
donated by aliens, no doubt.
Donated by aliens, right? And the Hollow Earth fantasies and things like that. So this is a pretty mixed bag and gets into some very, very speculative areas and in my opinion, some rather unsound areas.
What's so unfortunate about that, too, is because I really believe that there were ancient astronauts, that we were visited before, and then when they throw in this hodgepodge of things like Hitler escaping to South America in a saucer, it kills the credibility of the entire theory.
It really does. That is what makes this category so problematical. And as you just pointed out, the latest scientific theories and the latest cosmological models support more and more the notion that we live in a multiverse. The discovery of Earth-like planets is now unfolding at a staggering rate. I read sometime last year, during the time I was writing my book last year, that in 1 week they had discovered 100 Earth-like planets now. And we know that there are billions of stars in the universe capable of having planets like ours and capable of supporting life and supporting other civilizations. And so the evidence points to the high probability that Earth is an outpost for our species that has been visited by other civilizations. And it's really a shame that the crackpot element in the seventh category gets in the way of this more intelligent approach. It's hard to keep this story on track, though, George, because the myth of contact with another species is such a powerful myth that it impacts the human mind at a very deep level. And it's not always easy to keep our minds and our imaginations disciplined as we investigate this possibility.
In your opinion, are these visitors still coming back, or are they gone now?
Well, my views on the phenomenon have really been greatly affected by my deep immersion in this Nag Hammadi material over the last few years. And I am convinced of two things. First of all, that the human species, through our mind and our imagination, have the capacity to contact other parts of the universe and other dimensions, and that is part of the paranormal, and it is absolutely real, although we have to be disciplined about it. We can't do it in a crazy or reckless way. So I believe that all kinds of contact are possible to us. At the same time, I find a great deal of truth in the Nag Hammadi teachings, and the Nag Hammadi material, which says that there is one particular predatory species that we really must look out for, and that is causing a great deal of trouble in our world.
David Icke would say that they are governmental leaders and officials throughout the planet, and they're able to shapeshift.
Well, that's really taking it very, very far down the line, but I will tell you that in the Nag Hammadi materials, they describe the Archons, that's their name for these entities, as having shape-shifting powers. And that is exactly the word that they use.
Interesting. Number 8, you call shamanic or indigenous?
Right, shamanic, indigenous evidence. This is a vast category, and basically it covers all of the evidence that comes from traditional sources, like folklore of the American Indians. As you know, most of the American Indian tribes, the Zuni, the Hopis, all speak in almost a routine manner of our connection with other dimensional beings, spiritual entities who are not human, as the Kachinas, for instance. It's been proposed by anthropologist Frank Waters that the Kachinas of the Hopis are actually a type of ET or non-human entity. Among the Aborigines of Australia, among the almost every culture in the world that you look into will give some evidence that we have contact. But again, I must qualify that in most of these cases, the indigenous peoples distinguish between a wide range of entities who are favorable to us and a few isolated entities who are predatory. So this is a vast body of evidence, and I cite some of the books there. Also, Jacques Vallée's book, Passage to Magonia, is kind of an inventory of a lot of this.
And another classic, too.
Right. One of the interesting examples in this category, George, is the tulpas, as they're called, that we encounter in Tibetan Buddhism. Now, here's a piece of evidence that is actually can be demonstrated today. I mean, there are people living today in Tibet, and there are Tibetan masters who can, it is said, produce a tulpa. And a tulpa is actually like a virtual reality phantom that would appear right in front of you. And we know that the technology of virtual reality is now getting close to being able to do this. I mean, we sort of imagine that, say, people 10 or 20 years from now, instead of watching television, might sit in their room and watch a virtual reality production. Apparently, there are Tibetan masters who can produce these virtual reality images with their minds.
That's pretty powerful stuff.
Pretty powerful. And there are actual accounts of this. The most famous one, of course, is in the story Magic and Mystery in Tibet by Alexandra David Neal. She was a French woman, a European, who penetrated into Tibet in the beginning of the 20th century. And she tells this hilarious story about how she was studying with a Tibetan master who could produce these tulpas who were so real that a non-observant person couldn't distinguish them from a real human being. And that she produced, with the aid of her master, a tulpa. They were taking a pilgrimage into the depths of Tibet. And this tulpa joined the group and went trekking with them through the mountains. And the hitch was that her master did not tell her how to dissolve the tulpa. So it became kind of an annoying hanger-on until she learned the trick about how to reverse the process.
And off it went.
So there's a possibility then, in this category, that some types of alien contact are the result of this tulpa phenomenon.
What if they're from another dimension or another multiverse?
Well, this is, I think, one of the great frontiers, and I sense that you're excited about this as well. Yes. I think this is one of the great frontiers of science now. You know, we're just reaching a point where science is beginning to admit that we live in a multidimensional universe. And so the next question would be, what is the key to opening the doors to those other dimensions? Now, I believe, and I bring this point up in my book because I deal with the ancient or indigenous wisdom of Europe, that people in ancient times, especially people in the traditions of shamanism, were able to do just that. You know, one way that you could define what is a shaman is it is a person, a man or woman, and there were many women shamans, who is able to pass freely from one dimension to another. Mm-hmm. One way that this is done is through lucid dreaming.
Sure, or mood-altering mushrooms or things like that.
Or using mushrooms. The use of sacred plants or psychoactive plants, as far as I know, was common to all the great shamanic practices. So it was a tool. It wasn't used for intoxication or fantasy. It was a tool. Another word that comes up is bilocation. A shaman is someone who has mastered the ability to bilocate. And, of course, currently or recently, we've heard a lot about that in the works of Carlos Castaneda. Now, I know many people consider Castaneda to be a fraud, and they say that he invented Don Juan and all of that. And I have no argument with that. But when you look at the actual experiences that he described, they are consistent with traditional shamanic experiences. And Castaneda, as you know, vividly describes bilocation. A shaman is someone, just imagine this, who can be, in two places at once. I mean, if I were an accomplished shaman, I could be here in this house in Spain, and I could be with you in the studio right there, not just on the telephone.
What a gift that would be.
That would be terrific. And this is no fantasy. There is a long-standing record that this is really possible. So if I think the exciting thing here, George, is that if we gain an understanding and an acceptance of a multidimensional world, then each and every one of us has to ask ourselves, how can we enter in a sane and safe way into that experience?